Hi, everyone. My name is Quintera. I go by Q, Maxwell. I am a licensed mental health counselor in Brooklyn. Thank you so much. You see it, Brooklyn. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elowyn Samadhi. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I work at Sage Integrative Health and also at UCSD on the psilocybin for phantom limb pain trial.
Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you. My most important role is the chair of the board of directors for the Chacruna Institute. And the QR code isn't up there, but I hope you will consider donating in reciprocity to Chacruna today sometime, and tomorrow too, if you like. I'm Jamie Beachy, and I am also a spiritual care practitioner by training, so I'm one of the few chaplains that is also a MAPS training consultant and MAPS MDMA therapist. And I think that's all I'll say for now. I have particular interest and love for end-of-life care and psychedelics and working in healthcare settings. So thank you for being here with us today.
Hi everyone, I'm Genesee Herzberg, she and they pronouns. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and co-founder of Sage Integrative Health, which is a holistic psychedelic therapy clinic. I also have worked in the past and will work in the future as a consultant and trainer for MAPS, now Lycos's MDMA for PTSD program. Nice to be here with you all.
Cool, so I guess we can jump right in. And the first question that I have here is for Jamie. And I want to ask you, what does ethical touch mean, and how do you provide ethical touch?
Thank you for facilitating, Alejandra. So my hope is that together we'll build an answer to that question, and we'll also invite your comments and questions at the end so that we can think about this together as a community. But for me, a simple way to get at this is to think about, is what I'm offering in the best and highest interest of the person that I'm with? And how am I working with the sacred trust that they have, offered me in this moment in inviting me to be supporting them in some way, whether it's in my role as a spiritual care professional at the end of life when, perhaps someone is dying or their loved one has just died, or in a psychedelic session when someone is in a really vulnerable situation and needing support and care. Am I offering this gesture, because it's something that I need, or something that I want to indulge in, or because I'm taking advantage of the situation? That would be unethical in my view. Or am I offering this because it is for their highest good, and I've educated myself on, the role of consent and how to recognize whether or not this is something that is more my need or theirs? And am I consulting with a community of practitioners who can give me feedback and also hold me accountable, because sometimes I will fool myself into thinking that what I'm offering is in their best interest when really it is more for me. There's a lot of vulnerability in any caregiving or helping professional relationship, and so taking that seriously and really regarding it, and if you're an atheist or non-religious, I think there's still you can come up with your own language, but the sacred trust that we're being given to care for in this relationship is really central for me. And just to say one more thing about this before we continue this conversation, it also includes a recognition of power dynamics and issues around identity, and so if you're caring for someone from a marginalized community that you don't belong to yourself, to really take that into consideration as well and consider, am I the right person to negotiate with this care seeker around what they need or want or don't want, or is there, you know, another person that needs to come into this situation to make this more empowering situation? So there's a lot of things to talk about here, and I will hand it back to Alejandra so we can keep this going.
Thank you, Jamie. This next question I have for Elowyn, and it is, what are some of the reasons for and for not providing ethical touch in psychedelic-assisted therapy?
Yeah, so I think the emphasis here is on ethical touch. Obviously, there's a very long list of reasons why to not provide unethical touch. So thinking again about all of the offerings that Jamie just talked about as far as what is ethical touch, the consensuality around it, the cultural sensitivity of it, the trauma-informed nature of it, within the scope of the provider's practice, all of these pieces, right? So taking that into consideration, generally, it's going to be more than this, but generally I think reasons to provide ethical touch tend to fall in 3 categories. And those are safety, support, and activating or focusing is another word that people will use. And so safety is literally just to ensure the safety of the client so that they're not harmed in any way. An example might be that you know, someone is deep in the medicine space and laying supine and they need to go to the bathroom and they get up really quick and get lightheaded and start to fall. In that instance, ethical touch would necessitate that we support that person in not being harmed. So that's one example. For supportive touch, there's sort of 2 arms. How I see it is there's sort of 2 arms there, and one is providing support to relay companionship to the client within an experience. So perhaps someone is processing very deep layers of grief, and in that moment, you ask or they ask for a hand on the shoulder or a hand on the back. And so you're there really relaying that interbeing, that interconnectedness quality of I'm here with you, so that they can continue to stay in their process. The other arm that I see support providing is more for containment or you know, de-escalation or regulation. So if a client is maybe in actually a process where they're really touching into terror, they might ask for your hand in that moment, or you might offer a hand. And that is to provide a level of containment or deregulation, downregulation, just so they can stay with the experience. It's not to necessarily move them out of it, but it's to give them the support they need to keep going in that experience. And then activating or focusing is really, it serves the intention of deepening a process. So an example might be that someone is really working through some rage and they want to push against something. So you might offer your hands to push against. Or if they're working with something that feels very perinatal, maybe they're having a sense of being in the birth canal and feeling pressure here, you might offer a hand to let their head push against. So those are 3 general categories of maybe reasons why you would offer ethical touch. And then reasons why to not offer ethical touch. So I noticed my answers tended to land on the provider for this when I was thinking about it. And the first is we really want to make sure we're with ourselves before we offer any touch. And so a reason to not provide ethical touch is that you're actually not grounded and centered within yourself first. We really want to be in our own bodies before we contact another person's body. Another might be that you actually, as the provider, feel uncomfortable with what is being asked. You know, it's possible someone wants a hug, you have consented to hugs before the medicine, and in that moment, maybe your body actually doesn't feel safe to offer that. So that would be a reason to not provide it in that moment. You could offer something else in exchange, like a hand that you do feel comfortable with, or offering them to hold something that they can hug. Another reason is that if you're ever unsure, if the touch falls within the bounds of what was discussed, or if you're not sure that this person has the ability to tell you yes or no, if you've agreed that you can offer it and wait for their signal, then don't touch. Just hold that in. And then the last thing, and it does sort of edge into, I think, unethical touch a little bit, but it felt important to say, and that's a provider touching because they are outside of their own window of tolerance as the client is having an experience of some kind. So it could be a big spiritual experience, it could be terror and rage, it could be deep grief, and if your own window of tolerance is affecting you and you feel the need to contain the client, that would be a reason to not provide ethical touch, even if you have a sense that they may need it. If it's for you, right? Why am I touching? Wait. I know it's also why am I talking, but why am I touching works great too. I think that's another reason.
Great, thank you very much, Elowyn, for that very thorough and informative answer. I want to ask you, Q, what factors need to be taken into consideration when providing ethical touch? And what do you think about those things?
Great question, Alejandra. So some of my panelists have tapped into this a little bit, but things to be thinking about, like Jamie mentioned, this concept of power and control, which in the hours of medicine work that I've done with substances and without, there's this idea of who's in charge, who's in control of our time together. So that needs to be taken into consideration. Culture, of course, and culture in like a macro and a micro kind of way. Culture of the person in front of you, the persons in front of you, the people in front of you, and their mores and values and their cultural norms inside, but also the culture of the United States or wherever it is that you're practicing, and how there's both of those influences. Most of my clients are clients of color, and so we talk about like this dichotomous, multi-influential thing that happens. And then someone else spoke about this, I believe it was you, Elowyn, who talked about this trauma-informed sense. And so we want to be talking to our clients and whatever our capacities are about traumas that they've experienced, whether that's spiritual, bodily, mental, et cetera, ways that it shows up for them. This is the way that I do it. I talk about it. I talk about how does it show up for you? How do I know that that's what's happening? And then I talk about ways with clients that they want to let me know that they are in need of touch. If they are not able to have it be something verbal, maybe we've come up with a signal or some other predetermined way to do that. And the way that I navigate all of that, Alejandra, in my practice is with talking. It takes a lot of self-reflection in order to be able to go to these hot button, quote unquote, issues and topics. The culture of the United States is very puritanical. So we shy away from sex and sexuality, and touch goes into that, even though it doesn't have to be sexy or sexual, but it is intimate. And so it can create kind of this atmosphere of secrecy, you know, if it's unspoken. And so I bring it up immediately. Session 1, we're talking about power and control, culture, consent, all of those things. And it's important to have it be a living conversation that can grow and change, revoked, given, et cetera, throughout our time together, you and your client's time together.
Awesome, thank you so much, Q. And I have one question for Genesee, which is, what are some of the common ethical mistakes that people make?
Thanks for the question, and really appreciating all of your beautiful answers so far, so thorough. So yeah, there are a range of different ethical mistakes that people can make, and I wanted to note that the field of psychotherapy as a whole has largely moved away from including touch because of the potential for ethics violations. That's not always the case. There are some smaller segments within the field, more in the somatic realm, that do include touch, but for the most part, touch is not a part of psychotherapy. And so stepping into the psychedelic therapy realm, we have been bringing touch in because it's clear how impactful it can be for people in general to heal early relational wounding, and especially for people in sensitive psychedelic states. But all of those ethical concerns are still there, and they're ones we need to pay close attention to in order to avoid them in our practices. So I see the ethical mistakes as ranging from subtle to explicit. So it's not just about, sexual violations. There are much subtler mistakes that we can also make. So, on the subtler end, I want to start by talking about consent. Pretty much any psychedelic therapist meaning to include touch in their work is going to have a conversation about consent for touch, but that conversation might be very quick and minimal. And meanwhile, there's a lot to talk about there. Many things to go over, including what touch can look like, people's history around touch, et cetera, things that folks have already mentioned, but also really starting to understand people's relationship to consent, to saying yes and saying no, and being able to do so in an embodied way. For the most part, we're not taught to do that in this culture. We're taught to say yes when we mean no a lot. And so really gauging whether the client is able to say no, is able to assess whether they have a no, and if so, to say it is an essential element of beginning this conversation. And then moving into talking about all of the different ways that touch can look, and what are they comfortable with and what are they not. And will they be able to say no in the moment if they don't want touch and you offer it? Will they be able to ask for it if they do want it? There's a lot of baggage that can be laden on these things, like asking for what you need. Am I asking for too much? Or saying no to someone, am I going to hurt them? So really talking about these things and even practicing them beforehand so that the client can truly say yes and say no in the session under the influence of a medicine. Moving on from there, it's really important that the therapists know how to attune to subtle nonverbal cues. So another mistake would be not paying attention to nonverbal cues. So perhaps the therapist has asked the client, would you like me to put my hand on your arm? And the client kind of shakes their head yes or says yes, but then kind of pulls away that way. I've seen this happen in a video of an MDMA session before, and the therapist just wasn't noticing that the client was saying no with her body. So that could be experienced as a significant violation to that client, even though they said yes. Another example is for the therapist to use the touch for their own gratification. Now, Jamie touched on this a bit already, but there are many different ways that the therapist might seek validation from their client, ranging from a desire to be loved and cared for, to a desire to be seen as special or powerful, to a desire for sexual gratification. And so they may feel that touch is a way to obtain that. And while this seems somewhat innocent and may happen in, kind of passing waves in a moment, if it's used in a continual way over time, it turns into a really problematic dynamic where the client is maybe kept in this sort of relationship of meeting the therapist's needs and not able to kind of slowly develop their own sense of independence and not needing the therapist over time, or not needing this kind of contact over time. Meanwhile, it is really normal for the client to be getting their needs met from the therapist. So, but that really should be going largely in one direction there. And then we move into more kind of sexual energy, and this is even prior to sexual touch. So perhaps there's touch happening where the therapist has their hand on the client's chest, say, for example, or stomach, or even just arm, not to a part of the body that's considered typically sexual. But there is erotic transference and countertransference there. There's sexual energy running, and that, that's invited. We do on the client side. We let clients know that all feelings are welcome, including sexual feelings, but that the therapist will hold a boundary around sexual feelings. And what that means is that on the therapist part, the therapist is not running their own sexual energy. If anything, they're grounding it and creating a firm energetic boundary around their sexual energy. And then the last piece is, of course, sexual violations. And there's a lot of potential there, what with the kind of idealized transference and power dynamics that can happen in a psychotherapy relationship. There's inherently a power dynamic just in the psychotherapy relationship itself, and then when you take into account different identities, there can be a pretty major power differential there, and that can really be misused by the therapist. And meanwhile, the client may experience a pretty strong idealized transference where they're seeing the therapist as all good based on their own early wounding. And the therapist can step right into that, feel, oh, great, I'm this, amazing therapist, and here to meet all your needs. And, oh, you want me to touch you there? Like, okay, you're asking for it, so I'll go ahead and do that. Even if the client asks for sexual touch, offering it in a psychedelic therapy session is a violation. There's one exception to that, which is when there's an agreement, perhaps the therapist is a sexual surrogate, and there's an agreement that the therapist and client are going in to work on sexual issues and that there will be sexual activity between the therapist and client. That is rare and perhaps controversial. But other than in those situations, no matter what the client, quote unquote, consents to in the treatment, it is a violation due to the power dynamic. So yeah, that was a lot. The last thing I'll say is that I think it's easy for us to look at some of these violations that have happened in the field already and say, that was those people, that's not me. And given the range that I just described, I think we're all prone to ethical violations, and it's really important that we look at that in psychedelic therapy trainings, that we talk about it in our own consultation and in our own therapy, so that we start to own those elements of ourselves, which can be shadow elements, our needs for gratification, our needs for sexual touch, our needs to be seen as powerful, and really work with them rather than the people who do that being kind of split off as scapegoats.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for all of the answers that you gave. We have to jump into questions and answers, but before that, I want to ask one last question for the entire panel, if you want to take just a minute or so to respond. And I think it's an important one. What does repair look like after a rupture has been caused?
I think there's the relationship that one has to themselves, to oneself, and I might start there, that having the kind of relationship with yourself as a practitioner, whether you're offering ceremonial support or psychedelic support. And I guess we didn't really talk about working within your scope, but I'm just going to throw that out there, that don't be doing somatic experiencing if you're not trained like Elowyn is in somatic experiencing. Even if you think you know a little bit about it, really stick with your training. But have an agreement with yourself that if you start to feel inner conflict, that you have someone to talk to. That's maybe the first step in repair, because if you don't have that agreement with yourself, then and you're comfortable sort of generating or swimming in the waters of self-delusion, then you won't be able to really be present to a person when they say, that didn't feel good to me, or that wasn't right. Sometimes the client won't even, or the care seeker won't even recognize the transgression, but you need to recognize it yourself. Like, I'll just throw an example out there for you, because I have many that I could draw from, that are more in the subtle territory, fortunately. But, I remember being in the room with a family in the the woman had just died really, really tragically. It was like in an emergency room situation. I was in my 20s. And I was just so overwhelmed with sadness and grief that I just kind of like went to one of the people in the room and hugged them and was just holding on to them for my dear life. And afterwards, to be able to reflect with myself, okay, that didn't feel right. Why didn't that feel right? How can I go to supervision? How can I talk about this? Be open to being honest that this happens to everyone at certain moments, and the more we talk about it with each other, the more honest we are with ourselves, the more likely we'll be able to repair. So I'll let others get at the other parts of repair, but I think that, for me, that feels foundational.
Something that's all of us have said here has been about the importance of being trauma-informed, and part of that for me is modeling. And so words matter because it lets us, everyone involved, know that we're on the same page and that we're not diluting ourselves or each other. But there's also this piece of modeling wellness, or like modeling healthy behaviors, that so many of the people coming to us seeking care have not witnessed. And so kind of letting our clients see that we're human beings who are making mistakes and who are responding in real time to the mistakes is such a deep part of the process of healing. It's the medicine that's doing so much, but it's so many of these other pieces of trust and trusting that the provider is going to provide care. And so it just takes so much bravery, like kind of what you were just saying about being honest with ourselves first and foremost, and then risking taking away this viewpoint that our client has about, oh, we're so great and you've done so much for me, thank you, and being human beings together. So it's so important to do that.
Yeah, I think maybe what I want to add is there's an attunement that is needed in that rupture repair process. If you have a tendency to, maybe we all have a tendency to either push down something or make something too big, actually, over-identify with something. And when you do that, you actually make it about you, and you don't leave room for the client. So there has to be a just so-ness about it, where you're really meeting the client just so where their experience is, without minimizing and without adding too much to it. And that requires a great deal of patience. And there can be an urge, and this is true from my work with moral injury, there can be an urge to want to hurry up and get to the repair. But what's actually really important is to hang out in the rupture a little bit. So to really make space for that and what it was like and what it reminded you of. And really, like with one client where maybe we don't have time for me to get into that narrative, but let's just say they actually thought that they assaulted me. So they were very confused. There was an ego death, and while we were hugging, and I had no idea, and then we merged. I had no idea, and we merged. So the next day, he thought he had assaulted me. And it took 2 months to process that. The first month was really just holding the space, because he had already been coming in with this idea that he had done some wrongs in his life that he was really wrestling with. He had moral injury. And so this idea of being a perpetrator was really kind of ripe in the space. So I guess I want to encourage providers to slow that process down and to really give it its due time before you move into what repair looks like, because the person cannot find repair within their own body if they don't actually first feel the completion around the sense that there was rupture.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating all of your thoughtful responses. You've said a lot there about the kind of interpersonal repair that can happen when the therapist or the client is sensitive enough to know. So maybe I'll speak to what it could look like if it doesn't come up in the therapy and then the client goes on to make a report externally or publicly, which we're seeing happen now every once in a while and will likely happen more. So, first of all, I don't think we have adequate systems to support repair and accountability in the psychedelic field thus far. I think it's something that's sorely missing and that I hope that we can bring together soon as a community. I know there are pockets here and there, but something more widespread. However, I think there are some things that can happen, such as an accountability team, a group of people who know the person who committed the violation, usually the therapist or the group facilitator, and can sort of hold accountability for that person, talk with them about what they all agree accountability and change might look like, with input from the person who was impacted. And and then going through a process that ensures that the therapist, the facilitator, addresses the impact on the client and also does their own work. And that can look a variety of different ways, but generally is going to involve some deep personal work, because often those violations are coming from unmet needs. And then, on a larger scale, I really would like to see more of a restorative justice model coming in so that, again, we're not scapegoating, we're not canceling, we're not pushing people away, but instead we're finding ways to call people in and help them to heal and repair in a way that the person impacted feels is helpful to them. So addressing both the needs of the person impacted and also the needs of the person who did the violation.
Thank you all so much. This has been super important, especially as the field is emerging. And I think we have about 8 more minutes for Q&A if anyone wants to ask any questions to the panel.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm the founder of Chanka Institute based in Oregon. And I don't know if many people know about the rules set in Oregon. Facilitator is highly limited to the touch. Oregon permits only shoulder, hand and feet. And I really appreciate this conversation because I think touch is extremely important in practice. I have 2 questions for you. One is, what tools or strategies would you recommend to facilitators who are limited to touch, and when the client requesting a touch, and how would you offer alternative touch? And a second, what are your thoughts on clients touching themselves during the session when they have a need to release sexual energy or any other energy during the session? Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. For practitioners who are limited in the amounts of touch that they can do, which is most of us, above ground. When I work with clients and do prep, I talk to them about bringing in objects to support their comfort. And we talk a lot about physical grounding, different somatic manifestations. And so quite often my clients will bring in like stuffed animals, or they'll wear their favorite t-shirt that they rub on, or things of that nature. Because there's a fine line with relying on us for that and then like a self-reliance, which a lot of clients are also working on. And so sometimes there's this dance in sessions where I can see the distress of a client, but then they're self-soothing in a really confident and beautiful way. And so we talk about alternatives in that way.
I can speak to the second question. I want to just name that this is a potentially very controversial and charged topic right now, given some of the violations that have happened in the field. And I can imagine that many therapists and guides are leaning more to the side of caution right now. And sexual energy is an incredibly important part of who we are. And it's also a common energy to come up in psychedelic sessions. And so to limit that sexual energy in the course of a psychedelic experience could be, if not problematic, it could at least feel stifling for the client or limit growth and transformation. So I think this decision needs to be made on a case-by-case basis on the therapist's end in terms of their own level of comfort relating to sexual energy, their own and others, and also their own ability to maintain really clear boundaries while doing so. So, if someone's got solid training in sex therapy or sexological body work, I think there's potentially a lot more room to do that in a professional way. If not, I think, like I said, each therapist needs to make the decision about what they can safely hold space for the client for. One option, as you mentioned, is to allow the client to have space to work with that energy on their own. You, of course, want to make sure that they are safe and protected in there, not feeling abandoned. But yeah, the therapist being present could bring on a whole other set of very complicated issues. So I don't claim to be an expert in this area, but I do think it's one that requires a lot of thought before, stepping forward with it. But that it is worth thinking about because, like I said, sexual energy is essential.
I would just add, that I appreciate you bringing in alternatives. So to always have alternatives that are safe and that are, using the breath, moving energy in certain ways that is safe for everyone and within your scope, and holding that sacred trust with another person. It's important to always have a sense of a range of possibilities so you don't feel like you're either, cause there's a risk that you would abandon or shame someone if you just say, no, we can't do that, and that's it, without saying like, let's use the breath, let's ground, let's do this other practice that I think will really be helpful for you in this moment. And, in yourself, you're just saying this is within my scope and comfortable for me as well, and will protect this space.
I'll just add, big fan of weighted plushes. I have many of them, and they're really useful, especially if clients are moving into regressed states. So now we've got this stuffy here that has a lot of weight, and this weight can then be put somewhere on the client's body, including places that I don't have the training or within the scope of my practice to touch. So weighted plushes are great. Having a weighted blanket can also be really resourcing. I also have some fidgets and soft stones that I'll use. If someone wants to push, they can push against a wall, actually. They don't need to push against my hands. You can also do touch with objects in between you and the client. So if someone wants, let's say I don't touch viscera, just because it's too confusing. And so when people are in medicine. And so if someone wants a hand right there, I'll have them put a pillow here and I'll push on the pillow. And so you can use things as like an intermediary between the touch that keeps things a little cleaner. And I just want to say, I think it's very important for everyone doing this work to get touch training. It's quite ridiculous that touch has been this thing that's become unethical when it happens all the time. A cultural norm is to shake your hand. There's touch with your client. So I strongly recommend, no matter what the limit is, to actually go and seek touch training so that you know how to provide touch training, even if the only type of touch that you provide is in the form of safety. you should know how to touch someone safely that way. So I just want to really push that.
Thank you, Elowyn. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, and a part of ethical touch is only touching within your scope of touch training. So if you've gotten touch training around safety touch, just stay there. If you've gotten more elaborate touch training to, you can do more elaborate touch work. A lot of the touch trainings in the psychedelic therapy training programs out there are relatively brief. So even seeking out further touch training. There's a group called Relational Somatic Healing that does an amazing job with that I would highly recommend.
I just want to add one more thing on the end of this. I know you have a question, but there is a long history of really serious violations in this field, and just to honor that and all of the people that have been harmed, I feel like is important just to name. Maybe you're already aware of that, but I know that there are people here that have been harmed, and some of you may have not offered care in the best ways to another person. And so I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of hurt and grief and loss and confusion. I'm appreciating this conversation a lot, but wanting to just to honor that there really is a lot of work to be done and a lot of healing to happen. And if you have experienced like a violation yourself, to have that healed before you're moving into spaces with other people and ceremonial care or whatever it is you're offering. My heart is just speaking into the moment that there's just a lot of unhealed, experiences that we need to help each other with.
Well, we do have time for one more.
So I'm Leisha Skye, and I've had a bodywork practice for over 30 years. And I teach vocabulary of safe touch in ketamine workshops that are in person. And I find that the mental health field as a whole is so touch phobic. And I agree with Elowyn that you have to have your own experiences and your own training with body work. This is such an intimate thing to go into psychedelic space, and touch is part of the container. And touch involves more than just hands-on. Touch is the moment you walk into the space. Touch is proximity to the person you're with. Touch is the orientation, how you're facing them or how you're side by side. Touch is your history of touch as well as the history of touch of the person who's going to be receiving. Your voice is touch. Your voice is a vibration that touches people. Your gaze is eye contact. Your gaze is touch. There's a whole spectrum of touch here that's so complex and nuanced that I think everybody who's in the psychedelic space should be much more fluent in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything you have to say to answer that, I'd love to hear.
A beautiful statement, not really a question, but a beautiful contribution to the conversation. And I'll add that I think another important ethical consideration here is, what are you as therapists comfortable with? Like, in considering offering touch, what are your limits? What is it that you feel comfortable stepping into, given your training, but also given your personal history, also given your own relationship to touch? We can't offer ethical touch that we're not comfortable with, and often people, therapists as much as clients, and we both often are on both sides, don't listen to our own no's. So very important for us to be listening to our no's as well.
I'd like to add to what Leisha was saying, this piece about so many different kinds of touch other than physical, and this piece with client with helping clients understand their limitations, I think it's important to remember that we can decline to offer services to a client if we don't think that they're ready. There's so many people who don't understand these nuances and don't even know that they're existing. And so, like, how can a client tell us no or register that something is a violation? All of these things that we've kind of been talking about, and having our criteria and understanding our own limitations and saying, hey, maybe you should get some other support and other kinds of work should be done before you're coming into doing medicines. Maybe go do a softer thing first. Your intro to mental health maybe shouldn't be a ketamine clinic first. So, yeah.